Lohfink, 15 to 21. Some important questions you want to look at for the final. What does Lohfink say the story about Adam and Eve's life in and fall from paradise and the Cain and Abel story? Basically, Genesis 2 to 4 by the Yahwist writers. What are they actually about? Well, it's not actually about a historical account of the first two people, right? Or the first four people. Um, I hope you understand at this point that these early stories in Genesis are mythical, right? They're supposed to be taken symbolic, and it's not therefore about like some golden age at the beginning of history or something that we had once that we lost. Really, Lohfink comes to the conclusion, and many biblical scholars will agree with him, and theologians will agree with him, that it is about the human condition. It's about what it means to be a human being, right? It's not just about these first two people who screwed it up for the rest of us, or these first two people who set it up so that Christ could redeem us, right? It has to do with what it means to be a human being. We all eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? We all think that the good things that God gives us are bad, right? We all lack trust in God's goodness, right? Remember, Lohfink says that's the original sin. They didn't trust God's advice. It was their friend. They didn't trust him. Cain and Abel, you see the brother getting jealous of the brother. That happens to all of us, right? Maybe not always our sibling, but another human being somehow, right? So the story is about what it means to be human. And remember, that's what the ancients did. When they wanted to talk about what something meant, they wrote about its origins. So if they wanted to talk about what it meant to be a human being, they're writing about the first few human beings. And therefore, the situation before Adam and Eve, eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, this doesn't just show us about what it was like before, but this shows us about our human potential, right? What we could be like, what God is calling us to be. Right? That we could be intimate with the earth. We could be intimate with other animals. We could be intimate with each other. We could have an intimate relationship with God, right? We could all care about each other and treat each other as friends, take care of each other. It shows what we could be and therefore what we could become, right? We have this potential. So it's a nice compliment to the image and likeness of God that the priestly writers will later write about. Eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, therefore, represents not trusting God, right? Right? It shows us how it could be now, that we could live a life of trusting God. This was the original sin that they're talking about. And again, it's not just the first two people did it. It's something we all do. Now, a lot of people will talk about this, including many students that always write about they weren't obedient to God, right? They didn't do what he said, right? It doesn't quite fit in with the image of God that we get throughout the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Remember, we have to read canonically. It makes much more sense to understand this, that they didn't trust God and didn't listen to God. God did not take them out of paradise because he was punishing them, right? God told them what we need to do to live in paradise, and he gives us the choice to live in it or outside of it. It wasn't that God got angry at them for being disobedient. We see he still helps them. after they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the story, just like he still helps us if we don't listen to him. But when we listen to him, then his advice works. So he showed them the way to paradise. He showed them how to live in paradise. They didn't listen to him. They didn't trust him. And the result was that they took themselves out of paradise. They created those conditions by their own choices, just like us. So eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil symbolizes our lack of trust in God and therefore one another. When I say trust in God, I don't mean trust him, do what he says because he said so, but no, we trust in the goodness of God. We trust that what God is showing us or what God is doing for us in this life, right, which can be very hard and very difficult. I don't need to tell you about that. You know, what God can do, what God is doing in this life, what God is helping us to do is something good. That's the trust. Trust in the goodness of God. Even though there seem to be all kinds of terrible things happening, and even though it seems to be taking a long time, we trust that God is helping us to realize the paradise, uh, to find the true happiness, to become like Him, a community of loving persons. So, what does the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel tell us about the relationships between sin and participating in a community of loving persons? Well, sin is the opposite of being in a community of loving persons. That's what sin means. We don't love others as much as we can. And so we see the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which represents the lack of trust in the goodness of God, also expresses itself as lack of trust in the goodness of other human beings. And Adam and Eve start turning on each other, blaming each other, right? Adam blames Eve. Eve blames nature, right? The snake. What's going on in Cain and Abel, right? Antagonism towards one's own brother, destroying the relationship between human beings. We don't trust each other. We don't treat each other. We don't trust God. We don't trust each other. You know, we can't see. We can't. Some people are hard to. It's hard to find the good in some people. A trust in God means that you trust that God has put this person there for a reason. That God is working with them, right? Just the same way God is here and helping you. That they are God's child just like you are. And therefore you trust that there must be some good in them. And that there must be some good coming about through the struggles you're having with them. Right? And we see the results when we don't think about it that way. When we don't see the other person as brother. We don't trust that God is working in and through all of us. What happens? See each other as competition, as a threat. And Cain kills his brother. It's a warning to all of us what can happen if we don't see the good in the other and trust each other and trust that God is working in and through us all. So we already answered this question in the last section. Why would God create a world that is so easily corrupted by human sin? Well, once again, what is it that God wants? Right? God wants us to become a community of loving persons. Just like Him. Right? How can that happen? Well, love is a choice. right? We need free will. And with that free will comes a possibility of all this corruption. Cain had the choice not to kill his brother, to love his brother, even though he was having problems with him. That was the choice. That was the opportunity. That was a possibility. He chose a different possibility, and it had very bad consequences. But again, it all has to do with what God has done, all that has created the whole world for, so that we can be like Him and share in His joy. But being part of a community of loving persons is not something you can force on somebody. It's a choice. And therefore, the opposite choice also has to be a possibility. Okay, I hope this helps. Study for the final.